August 31st, 1944. A requisitioned house at the edge of Amiens, France, just before dawn. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Ebenbach is asleep in a real bed, the first uninterrupted rest he has allowed himself in 3 weeks. He has earned a formidable professional reputation across 5 years of war. He led the armored spearhead at Brody in 1941, driving more than 70 miles in 2 days against Soviet forces, and had since fought the British at Caen as one of the Wehrmacht's most capable armor commanders, the kind of officer whose career trajectory other German generals tracked as a benchmark for their own performance. 3 weeks earlier, he had told General Walter Vorlemont at OKW directly that the only sane course remaining to his forces was an immediate withdrawal to the Seine. Vorlemont ordered him to attack toward Mortagne instead. The attack failed, and most of his panzer group was destroyed in the resulting collapse at Falaise. By August 21st, what remained of the 7th Army had been placed under his command, which was, by that point, very little left to command at all. For 10 days he had been doing the one thing every officer of his professional generation had been trained, across a war fought from Moscow to the Caucasus, to do well. Conduct an orderly retreat, save the men, reach the next defensible river line, reorganize. He believed, on the night of August 30th, that his army was withdrawing ahead of an enemy still located somewhere to the south and west. He woke to find British soldiers standing in his bedroom. The 11th Armored Division had crossed roughly 40 miles of open countryside in 24 hours, not pursuing him from behind, but arriving at Amiens before he did. He was not behind the Allied line. The Allied line was behind him. The U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center's later account of the episode records the detail with a flatness that somehow makes it more striking rather than less. A general of his seniority and experience, captured in his bed, by an enemy that had simply arrived somewhere he had calculated it could not possibly be for at least another day. This is not primarily a story about Eberbach. It is a story about a pattern that repeated across France, Belgium, and finally inside Germany itself through the war's final 8 months. German commanders gave the textbook order to retreat, and watched that retreat collapse into encirclement within hours, rather than the days every rule of pursuit warfare in European military history had always allowed. 2 complete German armies were trapped at Falaise. A third pocket near the Belgian border closed before either side fully realized what was happening. More than 300,000 surrendered in the Ruhr the following spring, a larger single capture than Stalingrad. And in the post-war interrogations German generals gave to the U.S. Army's historical project under Franz Halder, the same complaint recurs without resolution. They could not explain how the Americans kept arriving first. The geometry should not have permitted it. A retreating force should always be able to outpace its pursuer, because the pursuer has to fight through rear guards along the way. That had always been the rule. The answer is not Patton's personality, although Patton mattered. It is not superior armor, since the Sherman was outclassed by the Panther in nearly every direct technical comparison. It is not air power alone, although air power was indispensable. The answer is an integrated system, assembled from a question almost no one in 1939 thought was urgent, tested nearly to failure at Kasserine in 1943, and operational by the late summer of 1944 in a form the Wehrmacht had no organizational equivalent for and no answer to. Here is a fact that should substantially rearrange the popular image of the German military machine. The Wehrmacht was not, in any meaningful sense, a motorized army. In November 1943, of 322 German Army and SS divisions then in existence, only 52 carried armored or motorized designation. By November 1944, the ratio was 42 of 264. German horse usage in active service hovered around 1.1 million animals at any given time across the war. A standard infantry division at full strength carried roughly 5,300 horses, 1,100 horse-drawn vehicles, and only about 950 motor vehicles, a ratio that, if anything, worsened rather than improved as the war progressed, with some divisions by 1944 carrying upward of 6,300 horses on their rolls. The lightning advances through Poland, France, and the Soviet Union that define the popular image of blitzkrieg were executed by a thin, armored and motorized spearhead, leading a much larger body of infantry whose supply trains moved at a horse's walking pace. The tip of the spear moved fast, the shaft behind it walked. The practical consequence of this ratio became most visible precisely at the moment a formation needed to move quickly without warning. Exactly the situation a forced retreat under pressure created. A division that could march its infantry only as fast as its horse teams could pull artillery and supply wagons over whatever roads remained passable was, in the relevant tactical sense, no faster retreating than it had been advancing, regardless of how badly its commander wanted to outrun a developing encirclement. The motorized spearhead divisions fared somewhat better, but even they depended on fuel supplies that, by the summer of 1944, Allied strategic bombing of German refining capacity had made progressively less reliable to count on. This matters specifically for the question of retreats, because a walking army, even one with a small motorized vanguard, retains one structural advantage that is held across most of military history. It can generally disengage faster than a pursuing force can envelop it. Encircling a retreating army requires marching around it on roads no shorter than the ones it is using, with troops who have just finished fighting it, without any decisive advantage in speed. This is the specific mechanical reason retreating armies have historically tended to escape destruction even after a serious defeat. The German army's long retreat across the Eastern Front between 1943 and 1945 bled men and equipment by the hundreds of thousands, but the Red Army achieved a true encirclement at speed only once in that entire period, Operation Bagration in June 1944, and that single exception required weeks of deliberate preparation across hundreds of miles of front. Eberbach had been trained, like every senior German officer of his generation, inside an operational world where the rule held reliably enough to plan around. In 1939, the United States Army ranked roughly 19th in the world by most contemporary measures, behind Romania. Its cavalry establishment as of December that year consisted of 2 mechanized regiments and 12 horse regiments. Its tank force was a curiosity rather than a serious arm. Nothing about the institution in 1939 suggested it would become, within 6 years, the first army in the history of warfare to fight as a fully motorized force from divisional level down. A small number of officers inside that unimpressive institution had nonetheless been working through 2 specific, unglamorous problems that almost no European general staff in 1939 considered worth particular attention. First, how do you keep an entire army, not just the spearhead, but the kitchens, the artillery, the medical units, everything, moving at the speed its trucks can actually go? Second, how do you direct that moving mass with enough speed that it can adjust its plan in minutes rather than hours? The first problem was fundamentally an industrial one, and the American answer to it was straightforward mass production. The GMC CCW 2.5-ton truck, universally known to the men who drove it as the Deuce and a Half, rolled off Detroit area assembly lines in numbers that let the United States put every single infantry division on wheels by 1944, the only army in the world to have done so completely. The Soviet Union, fielding enormous motorized forces of its own by the war's later years, depended on more than 400,000 American trucks shipped under Lend-Lease to sustain that capability. German truck production, even accounting for captured and requisitioned civilian vehicles pressed into service, never approached the scale either ally had achieved. German divisions, when they captured Allied trucks intact during the war's earlier years, frequently pressed them directly into service, rather than relying solely on domestic production. A quiet acknowledgement, in practice if not in doctrine, of exactly the production gap the Wehrmacht's own planners were reluctant to state plainly in official assessments. The second problem was about radios, and the gap here is, if anything, more analytically interesting than the truck production disparity, because it reflects a deliberate organizational choice rather than a simple resource constraint. The U.S. Army decided to put a radio not just in command vehicles, but in every tank, every battalion headquarters, every artillery battery, every forward observer team, and every fighter-bomber. German doctrine, by contrast, issued radios principally to command vehicles. A typical German tank platoon carried a radio set only in the platoon leader's vehicle, with the remaining tanks following visually or signaling by flag. German artillery relied heavily on pre-surveyed positions and wireline telephone communication, a system that performed excellently when the front line held roughly still, and progressively worse as the front began moving faster than wire crews could keep pace with it. A German signals officer attempting to lay telephone wire to support a rapidly shifting defensive line was, in effect, trying to solve a problem the underlying technology had never been designed to handle, while his American counterpart simply switched to a different radio frequency and kept moving. The combination meant the Americans were quietly building a force in which a forward observer could request corps-level artillery support and receive it within roughly 3 minutes. A tank battalion commander could shift his entire axis of advance with a single radio call, and a fighter-bomber pilot circling 4,000 feet above a French country road could hear a voice from the lead Sherman in a column below and respond to it in something close to real time. Nobody in Berlin took the American military establishment seriously enough in 1939 to study this development closely. The prevailing assumption among German planners held that American forces, if they fought at all, would fight the way Pershing's army had fought in 1918, methodically, slowly, a clock that happened to be correct only by occasional accident. February 1943 appeared, briefly, to confirm exactly that assumption. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces struck the inexperienced U.S. II Corps and drove it back in disarray. Roughly 6,000 American soldiers were taken prisoner, and both the German and British military establishments, for very different reasons, felt their respective suspicions about American readiness confirmed. What is less frequently quoted is Rommel's own later assessment after watching the same army he had humiliated at Kasserine fight him again in Sicily, in Italy, and finally across France. The observation, preserved in his papers and cited in Carlo d'Este's biography of Patton, holds that the initial American setback improved rapidly into something Rommel, by his own characterization, considered the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare he had personally witnessed. This was not praise Rommel, the architect of the Wehrmacht's own mobile warfare doctrine and reputation, offered casually. He was watching a capability he had not previously encountered and could not match. To see what specifically produced that reaction requires returning to a hot, dusty stretch of road near Saint-Lô in late July 1944, where a German general named Fritz Bayerlein was about to discover what the new American system could do once unleashed. July 25, 1944. The U.S. First Army under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley launched Operation Cobra, a carpet bombardment of a narrow strip of the German front west of Saint-Lô by some 1,800 heavy bombers and hundreds of fighter bombers, followed by an armored push through the resulting gap at maximum sustained speed, with explicit instructions not to stop for flank security. The bombardment itself had a documented cost the American side absorbed without abandoning the broader plan. A portion of the heavy bomber force, bombing through smoke and haze, dropped short of the intended target line and struck American positions, killing Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the most senior American officer killed by friendly fire in the entire European war. The operation proceeded regardless, on the judgment that the breakthrough's strategic value outweighed the cost already paid to achieve it, a calculation that itself reflects the broader institutional willingness, visible throughout this account, to accept real losses in pursuit of speed rather than pause to fully assess and correct every individual failure before continuing. The defending formation, the Panzerlehr Division under Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, was on paper one of the strongest in the German army. Bayerlein himself had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, fought in Poland, France, and Russia, and survived a wound near Stalingrad. By July 1944, his subordinates had begun noticing he looked exhausted past the point of effective command. On July 26th, an officer arrived at his headquarters carrying a personal order from Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, Commander-in-Chief in the West. Hold out. Not a single man is to leave his position. Bayerlein's after-action report records his response with unusual bluntness. Every man was, in fact, already holding out. His grenadiers, his engineers, his tank crews, lying silent and mute in their foxholes because they were dead. Only the dead were still holding the line. His division, he wrote, was after 49 days of fierce combat, finally annihilated. The enemy was rolling through every sector. Calls for help had gone unanswered, because no one above him believed how serious the situation actually was. That last detail is the specific clue worth dwelling on. German higher headquarters, even 2 days into the breakthrough, was still operating on a 1940 scale time horizon, assuming hours or days of warning before a crisis demanded a response, when the actual situation was unfolding in minutes. The reason was that American armor on the far side of the bomb line was not behaving the way German doctrine expected an armored breakthrough to behave. Hans Stober of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, caught in the collapse, observed afterward, as recorded in Martin Blumenson's account of the campaign, that the Americans had learned the art of blitzkrieg themselves and were now ignoring their own flanks entirely in order to keep moving. On July 28th, Major General John Shirley Wood's 4th Armored Division advanced 10 miles in a single day and took Coutances. By July 30th, his lead element stood outside Avranches. By August 1st, the bridge at Pont-à-Beau was in American hands, and through that single bottleneck, over the following 72 hours, 7 divisions of the newly activated Third Army poured roughly 200,000 men and 40,000 vehicles. Patton himself, having spent months sidelined following the slapping incidents in Sicily and subsequently used as a decoy commander of a fictional army group meant to convince German intelligence the main invasion would land at Calais, was now fully activated and pursuing his own armored divisions down French country roads in an armored car, with the governor removed from its engine. By August 8th, his forces had reached Le Mans, 110 miles east of Avranches, not advancing in the conventional sense, but sprinting. On August 25th, the 81st Infantry Division, riding entirely in trucks, covered 280 miles in a single day. Everbach's Panzer Group, meanwhile, was still trying to execute the attack toward Mortain he had already told OKW was hopeless. While he pushed west on Hitler's order, Patton's forces moved east, then northeast, then north, and by August 8th, the geometry of the entire battlefield had inverted. German formations were attacking toward the coast, while American forces had already passed behind their southern flank, with British and Canadian troops pressing south from Caen to complete the trap. Bradley proposed what he later described in his own memoirs as a short envelopment, closing 2 German armies inside a pocket between Falaise and Argentan. On August 12th, Patton's 15th Corps under Wade Hayslip closed on Argentan, and Patton wanted to keep pushing north to seal the gap immediately. Bradley, concerned about the boundary line with Montgomery's forces approaching from the north and the risk of a friendly fire collision, ordered a halt, the contested decision historians still debate the wisdom of. The gap stayed open longer than the tightest possible version of the trap would have allowed. By August 19th, Canadian and Polish forces from the north linked with American troops at Chambois. By August 21st, the pocket was fully sealed. Estimates of trapped German strength ranged between 80,000 and 100,000. Roughly 50,000 were taken prisoner, around 10,000 killed, and 20,000 to 50,000 escaped through the gap before closure, without their tanks, guns, or trucks. Eisenhower, touring the site afterward, recorded in his memoirs that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. If accounts like this one, the unglamorous organizational decisions that actually decided battles, rather than the version that fits neatly in a highlight reel, are worth your time, a subscribe and a like help this kind of detail reach more people. The prisoners and the carnage are not by themselves the answer to why this happened the way it did. The answer is in the timing. 2 complete German armies, commanded by officers who had collectively spent decades mastering the art of orderly retreat, were trapped within 2 weeks of American armor coming off the leash at St. Lo. Why couldn't men with that much professional experience execute the one maneuver their training had prepared them for most thoroughly? Late August 1944. The German front in northern France has effectively dissolved. 3 corps headquarters, the remnants of the 58th Panzer Corps, 2nd SS Corps, and 74th Corps, together perhaps 20 divisions worth of fragments and stragglers, find themselves out of contact with any higher headquarters at all. Their commanders met near Saint-Quentin on August 31st, and according to Martin Blumenson's official U.S. Army history, formed a provisional army among themselves under General Erich Straube of 74th Corps, the only coordinated response available to officers with no orders and no functioning chain of command above them. The improvised nature of this command arrangement is itself worth dwelling on, because it illustrates something the broader German collapse in the West repeatedly produced. Capable, experienced officers, individually still functioning at a high professional standard, finding themselves with no institutional mechanism for receiving the kind of timely, accurate situational picture that might have let them make a better decision than the one available information supported. Straube was not incompetent. He was working from a picture of the battlefield that was, through no fault of his own intelligence-gathering effort, already badly out of date by the time he acted on it. Straube did the one thing available to him that turned out to matter. He intercepted Allied radio traffic and, combined with his own scouts' reports, correctly deduced that encirclement was imminent. He ordered a fallback toward a stretch of canals and marshland near the Belgian town of Mons, calculating that the terrain there might let his roughly 70,000 men, jumbled, exhausted, mostly without trucks, hold long enough to break out to the northeast. It was, by every standard of his training, the textbook decision: save the men, fight a delaying action, regroup. He estimated the march at roughly 43 miles through difficult terrain and believed he had time to make it. He did not have time. The U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodges was running parallel to his column on the southern flank, moving faster than his men could march on foot. The 3rd Armored Division advanced 30 miles northeast of Lyon on August 31st and another 40 the following day. By September 2nd, it had reached the Belgian border south of Tournai, 60 miles in 2 days. The 2nd Armored Division covered comparable distances on consecutive days. By the afternoon of September 2nd, the geometry from Straube's perspective had become, in the literal sense, impossible to parse. Intercepted Allied radio traffic referenced unit designations that should have been hundreds of miles to the south and west, and those same units were instead on the roads directly in front of his column. On September 3rd, the encirclement closed, and Blumenson's history records the encounter with unusual candor as a surprise for both sides. The 1st Infantry and 3rd Armored Divisions had not been deliberately maneuvering to trap Straube's force. They had been advancing east along their own separately assigned routes and arrived, by coincidence of timing and speed, directly across his line of march. Neither army had been aware of the other's approach until they collided. The 9th Tactical Air Command under Major General Pete Quesada, supporting 1st Army from the air, destroyed by its own count 851 motor vehicles and 652 horse-drawn vehicles in the Mons pocket on September 3rd alone. A detail worth sitting with specifically because it punctures the assumption that this was purely a contest of machines. In a war popularly remembered as fully mechanized, more than 600 horse-drawn German vehicles were caught and destroyed by American fighter bombers in a single pocket on a single day. The 1st Infantry and 3rd Armored together took between 7,500 and 9,000 prisoners that same afternoon. By September 5th, the total at Mons had reached roughly 25,000, including 4 generals, the second largest capture of the entire 1944 Western campaign after Falaise itself. Eberbach had already been captured at Amiens 2 days before Mons closed, taken by British armor that had covered 40 miles in 24 hours to reach him. On September 3rd, the same day Mons closed, Field Marshal Walter Model, newly installed as commander in the West, concluded it was impossible to hold positions in northern France or Belgium at all, and ordered a general withdrawal toward the Siegfried Line. Blumenson records that by this point, many German units, on encountering Allied forces, were simply no longer putting up organized resistance. Courtney Hodges himself reportedly told his staff on September 6th that the war would be over within 10 days if the weather held. He was wrong about the specific timeline, but not about the underlying verdict his own forces had just demonstrated. The German front in the West, as a continuous defensive line, had effectively ceased to exist. What produced this specific geometry? German forces consistently finding American units already positioned ahead of them, faster than any retreat could outpace, required more than trucks and radios alone, though both were necessary preconditions. The third element emerged from an arrangement made roughly 12 months earlier between an Army Air Forces general, largely unremembered today, and a ground commander who would go on to lead the entire 12th Army Group. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada, 39 years old in 1944, held a conviction that set him apart from much of his own Army Air Force's leadership. Close air support functioned best as a genuine partnership with ground forces, rather than an occasional favor extended to them. This view was, within the Army Air Force's own institutional culture of the period, somewhat heterodox. Much of the leadership that would go on to shape post-war American air power doctrine remained more interested in strategic bombing's independent contribution to victory than in the comparatively unglamorous work of supporting ground formations directly, and Quesada's eventual prominence within the tactical air community reflected a deliberate institutional choice by Eisenhower and Bradley to elevate officers who shared that specific priority. In the weeks before Operation Cobra, Quesada, convinced that Bradley's hesitation to fully concentrate his armor stemmed from concern about the strength of the German defensive line ahead, made Bradley a specific, narrow proposal recorded in the official Army Air Force's history of the Normandy campaign. If Bradley would commit his armor to a full, concentrated push, Quesada would furnish an aviator and a properly matched radio for the lead tank in each column, allowing it to communicate directly with the fighter bombers orbiting above. Bradley agreed immediately. The technical modification was straightforward. Strip a standard radio mount from an M4 Sherman, install a VHF set tuned to the same frequencies the P-47 squadrons used, and place an Army Air Force's pilot, not a ground signal specialist, on the handset, riding inside the tank, on the reasoning that a rated pilot could describe what he saw from the air in terms another pilot circling overhead would immediately recognize: the precise visual cues, the terrain features, the angle that made sense for an attack run, in a way a non-aviator relaying second-hand descriptions could not reliably replicate under combat pressure. The arrangement, refined through Operation Cobra, became standard practice across 1st Army and then the entire 12th Army Group under the name Armored Column Cover. From late July 1944 onward, every American armored division advancing in France maintained on average 4 to 8 P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting continuously over its lead column from dawn until dusk, the patrol relieved on station rather than allowed to lapse. The pilots circling at 4,000 feet could see what the men in the lead tank below them could not. The German anti-tank gun positioned behind the next hedgerow, the Panzer IV idling at a crossroads 2 miles ahead, horse-drawn supply wagons attempting to cross a bridge 8 miles up the road. Each P-47 carried 8.50 caliber machine guns and either 500 or 1,000-pound bombs, and a voice in the tank commander's ear. The Air Force pilot riding alongside him could request an attack with roughly the same informality as asking someone to pass the salt. The Luftwaffe, decimated across 1944 by Allied strategic bombing's specific targeting of German fuel production, could field essentially no comparable cover for retreating German columns. Rommel himself, in field reports written before his own death, had already noted American superiority in artillery volume and ammunition supply, and by late summer, the same imbalance had extended fully into the air. German fighter pilots who remained operational by this stage of the war were frequently held in reserve for home defense against the strategic bombing campaign, rather than committed to supporting ground operations in France at all, a strategic prioritization that made sense given Germany's overall position, but left German ground commanders functionally without the one capability that might have offset at least part of the American advantage in observation and coordination. The result was a tactical environment with no real precedent in earlier warfare. A retreating German column, even moving at night on side roads in poor weather, was never genuinely safe, because the observation covering it did not depend on ground reconnaissance that darkness or terrain could defeat. The Soviet Union, fielding comparably large motorized forces by 1944, never produced an equivalent effect specifically because it lacked this air-ground integration at the same density and immediacy. Motorization alone, without the continuous aerial observation layered directly onto it through a radio link a ground commander could use in real time, was not sufficient to reproduce what Quesada and Bradley's arrangement had built. The largest single demonstration of what this combined system could accomplish came in April 1945 in the industrial region around the Ruhr, a campaign that also serves as a useful check on whether the pattern observed at Falaise and Mons was a one-time fluke produced by unusually favorable circumstances, or repeatable operational capability the American Army had genuinely institutionalized by the war's final year. Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945, near Lippstadt, Germany. Lead elements of the U.S. Ninth Army moving south met lead elements of the U.S. First Army moving north. An unceremonious handshake, officers comparing maps, tank crews checking each other's vehicles for the white recognition star. Behind them, to the west, in a roughly oval pocket of German territory some 30 by 75 miles, sat the entirety of Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B. The 5th Panzer and 15th Armies, 7 corps, 19 divisions, support and headquarters units, somewhere between 320,000 and 400,000 troops by various post-war estimates, the largest single encirclement of the European war, completed in a single afternoon. Model had inherited a collapsing front from von Kluge after Falaise and earned, within the German military culture that genuinely respected the skill, the nickname Hitler's Fireman for his ability to assemble a defense out of essentially nothing, a reputation built specifically on his performance stabilizing chaotic situations on the Eastern Front earlier in the war, which makes his inability to repeat that performance in the Ruhr a particularly clear demonstration of how thoroughly the underlying conditions had changed. By April 1st, sitting inside a pocket already beginning to be reduced piece by piece, he could do the arithmetic plainly. The 116th Panzer Division by mid-April had no serviceable tanks remaining and no artillery ammunition at all, against 19 American divisions outside his ring, supported by Otto Wayland's 19th Tactical Air Command and Quesada's 9th, air formations that by 1945 understood with complete precision how to destroy a German column attempting to move on any road in daylight. The collapse that produced the encirclement had its own internal demonstration of the system's speed. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead between March 25th and 28th advanced 3rd Corps 12 miles on its first day and 20 on its second. By the 4th day, American forces stood at Gießen and Marburg, with 1st Army already 80 miles from its starting line. The subsequent wheel north, cutting across the rear of Army Group B as 9th Army turned south from the Wesel bridgehead, closed nearly 300 miles of central Germany in a week. 2 pincers, each individually covering distances that would have constituted a major operational achievement on their own, converging on schedule despite operating with no direct coordination between the respective approach routes beyond the shared objective both Army commanders had been given. Mass surrender followed in stages rather than all at once, and the staged nature of the collapse is itself worth noting because it shows German command structure continuing to function, in a formal organizational sense, well past the point where it retained any practical ability to alter the outcome. On April 14th, when 1st and 9th Armies linked a second time inside the pocket near Hagen, splitting it in two, the 15th Army under Gustav Adolf von Zangen capitulated, having lost all contact with its subordinate units. On April 15th, Model dissolved Army Group B formally rather than surrender it as an intact command, instructing his Volkssturm and non-combatant personnel to discard their uniforms and return home, a decision that preserved a kind of formal military propriety in his own mind, even as it had no remaining practical consequence for the roughly 300,000 men still inside the collapsing ring. The eastern half of the pocket surrendered en masse on April 16th, the western half on April 18th. Model shot himself on April 21st in a forest south of Duisburg rather than be taken prisoner, having told subordinates that a German field marshal does not surrender personally. The number of prisoners taken in the Ruhr pocket exceeded German losses at Stalingrad, roughly twice the figure U.S. intelligence had initially estimated the trap force to contain. An underestimate that itself reflects how difficult it had become, even for the side executing the encirclement, to track precisely how many German troops remained inside a pocket whose internal command structure had stopped reliably reporting its own strength upward well before the final collapse. American camp administrators processing the surrendered mass in the days that followed reportedly improvised holding areas along open stretches of the Rhine meadows, simply because no facility built for a conventional prisoner intake had been sized for a single capture of this magnitude. Step back across the full pattern. Falaise in August 1944. 2 armies destroyed. The Mons collision in September, a German corps group caught by surprise. Eberbach's own capture days earlier. The Ruhr in April 1945, an entire army group encircled in a single afternoon and dissolved within 2 weeks. In each case, the German command structure issued the textbook order to retreat and discovered, sometimes within hours, that the order had already become academic. The enemy occupying ground the retreating force had assumed would remain open for days. This was not improvisation born of individual battlefield genius, however much Patton's or Wood's personal aggression mattered at the margins. It required the German army to remain exactly what it was, a tactically formidable force, frequently superior man for man at the individual soldier and small unit level, built on an organizational culture that had no equivalent mechanism for matching the speed of decision and depth of communication the American system had quietly assembled over the preceding 5 years. The institutional origin of this capability is worth restating plainly, because it is easy in retrospect to treat American operational success in 1944 as an inevitable consequence of industrial superiority alone, when the actual sequence involved the specific set of choices that did not have to be made the way they were made. The decision to radio every tank rather than every fourth or fifth one was a deliberate doctrinal choice, made years before Pearl Harbor, by officers planning for a war the institution's own civilian leadership was not yet certain the country would fight. The Quesada-Bradley arrangement was an informal handshake agreement between two officers who happened to share a specific tactical conviction, not a directive issued from above by anyone in a position to mandate it army-wide from the outset. It became standard practice only because it worked visibly and immediately once tried, and was copied rapidly precisely because the institution had built, separately, a culture that rewarded successful improvisation by adopting it quickly, rather than subjecting it to a lengthy formal evaluation process first. Hasso von Manteuffel, captured at the war's end and later invited to lecture at the United States Military Academy in 1968, contributed to the same Halder-supervised historical project Eberbach worked on, and offered an assessment notably free of self-justification. The Americans, he concluded, had taken the German concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders empowering subordinate judgment, embedded it in radio communication at every organizational level, mounted the whole structure on trucks, layered continuous tactical air support directly on top of it, and produced something the Wehrmacht had no organizational answer for. The specific irony embedded in Manteuffel's assessment deserves to be stated directly. The doctrine the Americans had effectively out-executed was German in conceptual origin. Auftragstaktik had been a German invention, refined across decades of German staff college instruction, explicitly designed to push battlefield judgment downward to subordinate commanders. What German institutional and political conditions by 1944 could no longer reliably sustain, distributed authority flowing both upward and downward through a chain of command, increasingly centralized around decisions only Hitler personally felt entitled to make, the American army had built almost by accident, through a combination of industrial capacity, a specific radio doctrine choice, and one productive friendship between an air general and a ground general who happened to agree on a narrow tactical question at exactly the moment it mattered most. If this forensic account gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps stories like this one reach the people who care about getting the history right. Eberbach himself, contributing operational studies to the same project from British captivity until 1948, described every symptom in detail. The failed attack toward Mortain he had argued against, the collapse at Falaise, his own capture in bed at Amiens, without ever quite naming, in his own writing, the integrated system that had actually defeated him. He showed what had happened far more clearly than he explained it, and the empty space in his analysis where that explanation should sit is, in its own way, the most precise evidence available that the system worked exactly as designed, invisible to the man on the receiving end of it until it was already too late to matter.